My grandpa sold his ranch for $1. 2M and trusted Dad to care for him. But one stormy night, Dad threw him out like garbage. I took Grandpa in, and months later, he passed away. When the will was read, Grandpa's final wish left you, all speechless. Even me, my name is James, and this is a story I never thought I'd have to tell. A story about family, betrayal, and the secrets that can tear us apart. My grandpa was a man of few words, but big heart. A rancher who'd spent his whole life working the land he loved. Years ago, when his health started failing, he made a choice that would change everything for my family. He sold his ranch for $1, $2 million, and gave every penny to my dad with one simple request: take care of me. That promise was supposed to mean something. At least, that's what I believed, but things didn't go as I expected. One stormy night, the kind where the wind howls and rain pounds against the windows, I got a call that stopped me cold. My dad had kicked Grandpa out of the house, just like that, thrown out like trash. I couldn't believe it. The man who gave my dad everything was left out in the cold. Without a second thought, I took Grandpa in. I made sure he had a warm place, food on the table, and someone who cared. It wasn't easy watching him age and struggle, but I owed him that much. A few months later, Grandpa passed away quietly in my home. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me, heavier than I could say. Then came the will reading. I thought I knew what to expect, maybe a small gesture, a final gift. But when the lawyer spoke Grandpa's final wishes, the room went silent. Even I was stunned. It wasn't what anyone expected. What Grandpa left behind was more than money. It was a message, a reckoning for my dad, for all of us, and a truth that no one was ready to face. You said, expand ChatGPT said. I still remember that night clearly, the way the sky darkened early, and the rain started like it was trying to wash away something deeper than dirt and dust. The phone rang just as I was settling down, after a long day, and my heart sank the moment I heard my sister's shaky voice on the other end. James, she said, Dad kicked Grandpa out. He's standing on the porch in the pouring rain, and he won't come back inside. I froze. How could Dad do that? The man who had given him everything, who trusted him with his life, thrown away like an old coat. Grandpa was more than family to me. He was the steady rock, the quiet man who taught me how to ride a horse, how to fix a fence, how to never give up no matter how hard life got. And yet there he was, out in the storm, cold and alone because my own father had turned his back. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my coat and drove through the sheets of rain to find him. When I opened the door, he was sitting on the porch steps, drenched, shivering, but with that stubborn glint in his eyes that said he wasn't broken yet. I helped him inside, wrapped him in a blanket, and promised I'd never let him go through anything like that again. Those months were hard. Watching a man who once owned a sprawling ranch grow frail and dependent was heartbreaking. But more painful was the silence between Dad and me, the questions I couldn't ask and the anger I couldn't voice. Why did he do it? What had changed him so much that he could throw his own father out into a storm? I kept hoping for answers, but they never came. When Grandpa passed, it felt like the last piece of my old world crumbled. I was haunted by memories, his weathered hands, the stories he told by the fire, the way he looked at me with trust I wasn't sure I deserved. Then came the will reading, and everything shifted. The lawyer's voice cut through the room, steady but heavy with meaning. Grandpa hadn't left the money to Dad, not even a penny. Instead, he left instructions, detailed plans that no one expected, and a letter addressed to me. As the lawyer read Grandpa's final wishes, the silence in the room was deafening. Even Dad, who had seemed so confident all these years, looked lost. The truth was out, and there was no going back. That moment in the lawyer's office felt like time slowed down, like the air itself was holding its breath. The room was filled with people. I'd known all my life family, friends, neighbors, and yet none of us could believe what we were hearing. Grandpa had made it clear in his will that the $1, $2 million from selling the ranch, was not for Dad. Instead, it was set aside in a trust, and the trustee was someone none of us expected: me. I remember my heart pounding, the weight of responsibility sinking in before I even knew what to say. Grandpa's letter, the one the lawyer handed me afterward, was like a final confession, a window into the man I thought I knew. In his shaky handwriting, he wrote about disappointment, betrayal, and a broken promise. He told me how Dad had failed him, not just that night in the storm, but over years of neglect and selfishness. Grandpa trusted Dad to care for him, but what he got in return was abandonment. The letter went on to say that Grandpa's real legacy wasn't the money, it was the lesson he hoped I'd carry forward, that family means more than blood, that respect and love have to be earned and protected, and that sometimes doing what's right means standing up to those closest to you. It wasn't easy. Suddenly, I was caught in the middle of a family storm, far bigger than anything I'd faced before. Dad was furious, not just at Grandpa, but at me for following through on those final wishes. He saw the money as his birthright, something owed to him simply because he was the son. But Grandpa had made his choice, and it was clear he'd lost faith in his own flesh and blood. As the days turned into weeks, I began to understand that this story wasn't just about money or betrayal. It was about healing, about facing uncomfortable truths, and about deciding what kind of man I wanted to be, the son who stood by his father, or the man who finally stood up for his grandpa's memory, and that choice would change everything. Every morning after the will reading felt heavier than the last. The house I grew up in, the same walls that once echoed with laughter and stories, now seemed suffocated by tension and unspoken resentment. Dad stopped talking to me, his cold silence more painful than any angry words he could have thrown. Family dinners became battlegrounds of silence, glances filled with accusation but no reconciliation. It was like living with a ghost, one that carried the weight of betrayal and shattered trust. But I kept Grandpa's words close, his letter folded neatly in my jacket pocket like a lifeline. He had trusted me not just with money, but with a responsibility far greater, to honor his legacy by doing what was right, even when it hurt. And so, I made a decision that night, standing alone in the quiet of my room, staring out at the stars blurred by city lights. I wasn't going to let Grandpa's memory be tarnished by the bitterness Dad was so willing to embrace. I reached out to Grandpa's old friends, the neighbors who still remembered the ranch as if it were yesterday. They told me stories I'd never heard of a man who worked harder than anyone else, who gave everything he had not for wealth but for family and honor. I started piecing together a plan, one that went beyond money and inheritance. I wanted to rebuild what had been broken, to restore the dignity Grandpa deserved. But the hardest part was facing Dad. I didn't know if he would ever forgive me for what I was about to do, or if he would see it as betrayal. I knew this path would lead to confrontation, and maybe even the end of our relationship. Yet, deep inside, I felt something stronger, a resolve not to be silent in the face of injustice, even if it meant standing alone. The night I finally told him about the will, about Grandpa's wishes, I saw something crack in Dad's eyes, anger, yes, but also pain and regret. For the first time in years, he spoke not as a father demanding respect, but as a son who had lost his way. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it was a start, because this story isn't just about money or betrayal or broken families. It's about the courage to face the truth, to stand up when it's easier to turn away, and to find hope even in the darkest storms. Grandpa's ranch may be gone, but his legacy lives on, in me, in the lessons he left behind, and in the fight to heal a family torn apart. And that fight, that's only just beginning. Those first few weeks after that confrontation with Dad were some of the toughest I'd ever faced. Every step I took felt like walking through a minefield, family members picking sides, whispers behind closed doors, and the constant pressure of living up to Grandpa's final wishes. I wasn't just managing an inheritance. I was trying to hold together the pieces of a family that felt like it was fracturing right before my eyes. I spent countless nights sitting by the fireplace, reading Grandpa's old journals and letters, trying to understand the man behind the stern facade. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but his love for family, even when tested, was undeniable. Each page revealed more about the sacrifices he'd made, the dreams he'd held onto, and the disappointments he'd buried deep inside. It was like discovering a side of him I'd never known, and it made me feel closer to him even after he was gone. I started reaching out to local charities and community groups, setting up scholarships and funds in Grandpa's name, wanting to make sure his legacy helped more than just our family. It felt like the right thing to do, to honor the man who had given so much, not just with money, but with heart. And slowly, I began to see a shift. Some family members who had been cold started to soften, neighbors who had stayed silent began to offer support, and even Dad started showing signs of change. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, angry phone calls, and moments when I wanted to give up. But I kept reminding myself of that stormy night, of the look in Grandpa's eyes when he was turned away, and the promise I made to him. This wasn't just about me or Dad. It was about justice, about respect, and about breaking a cycle of neglect. One afternoon, months later, Dad came to me. No words at first, just a look, tired, regretful, but genuine. He didn't ask for forgiveness right away, and I didn't offer it. Instead, we started talking, slowly peeling back the layers of hurt and pride that had kept us apart. Those conversations weren't easy, but they were real, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like there was hope for healing. Grandpa's ranch might be gone, but the lessons he left behind are alive and breathing. This story isn't just about betrayal or money. It's about family, about standing up for what's right, and about finding the strength to forgive, even when it feels impossible. Because in the end, that's what Grandpa taught me, that love isn't always easy, but it's worth fighting for. And I'm ready to keep fighting, no matter what comes next. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, but the weight of everything that had happened never quite lifted. Each morning I woke with a knot in my stomach, knowing I had to navigate a path strewn with broken trust and raw emotions. But I also woke with a fierce determination. This was my Grandpa's legacy, and I wasn't about to let it fade into silence. I remember one evening in particular, sitting alone on the porch just like Grandpa used to do after a long day. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, and the quiet felt almost sacred. I held his letter in my hands, tracing the words he had written with trembling fingers. It struck me then how much he had carried alone, the burden of disappointment, the hope for a better future, and the faith that somehow I would carry his dreams forward. Rebuilding trust with Dad was harder than I ever imagined. There were moments of anger that exploded without warning, accusations thrown like knives, and silences so thick they almost suffocated us both. But there were also moments, small, fragile moments, when I saw a glimpse of the man my Grandpa once was reflected in my father's eyes. It gave me hope that beneath the bitterness and regret, there was still a chance for healing. I started inviting Dad to help with the scholarship programs and community projects I'd set up in Grandpa's name. At first, he declined, pride getting in the way, but slowly he began to join in. Those moments, working side by side, reminded us of what family could be when we chose to listen, to forgive, and to fight for something bigger than ourselves. Sometimes, late at night, I'd find myself thinking about that stormy night, the night that changed everything. How one moment of cruelty had almost broken us, but also how it sparked a fire in me to stand up, to protect, and to love fiercely even when it was hard. Grandpa's ranch was gone, but the spirit of what he built, the values he lived by, were alive in every choice I made. This journey has taught me that family isn't just about blood or money. It's about loyalty, respect, and sometimes standing alone against the tide to do what's right. And as I look forward, I know the road ahead won't be easy. But I carry Grandpa's voice with me, a reminder that even in the darkest storms, there's always hope and the chance to rebuild what's been broken. Because at the end of the day, that's what love truly is. Not perfect, not easy, but real and worth every fight. The nights after those long talks with Dad were some of the quietest I'd known in years, yet inside, everything felt restless, like a storm waiting to break. I kept replaying every word, every glance, trying to understand how we had come to this place, where the family I once thought unbreakable was hanging by a thread. It was painful, yes, but it was also the first sign that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. I found myself digging deeper into Grandpa's past, searching for clues in old photographs, letters, and the stories tucked away in forgotten drawers. I talked to his friends, old ranch hands, neighbors who remembered him as a man who worked from dawn till dusk, who valued integrity above all else. They told me about the sacrifices Grandpa made, how he had given up so much for his family, how his pride was tied not to wealth but to honor. It struck me that the real inheritance wasn't the money from the ranch, but these stories of resilience and unwavering loyalty. There were days when I questioned if I was strong enough to carry this legacy. The pressure was immense, managing the trust, keeping the family together, and facing Dad's anger and disappointment head on. But every time I felt like giving up, I thought about Grandpa sitting on that porch, watching the sunset, teaching me how to stand tall no matter what life threw at me. His strength wasn't in his fists or his words, but in his quiet resolve to protect what mattered most. One afternoon, I invited Dad to join me at a community event honoring Grandpa's memory. He hesitated, the old walls of pride and pain rising up, but something in his eyes softened. Watching him talk to the people who had loved Grandpa, seeing him listen to their stories and laugh quietly, I realized the man I once knew was still there, buried beneath years of hurt and mistakes. That night, as we drove home in silence, I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. No words were needed. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were traveling it together. This story, my story, isn't about the money or the betrayal or even the broken promises. It's about finding the courage to face the pain, the strength to forgive, and the hope to rebuild what was lost. Grandpa's ranch may have been sold, but his spirit lives on in every act of kindness, every moment of forgiveness, and every fight for what's right. Because family isn't just a word, it's a promise, and I intend to keep mine. The seasons changed, and with them, the subtle shifts in our family's story began to take shape. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, no sudden reconciliations or sweeping apologies, but a slow, steady healing that crept into our lives in quiet moments. Dad and I still had our differences, our silences, but the weight of anger was starting to lift, replaced by something fragile yet hopeful. I remember one evening when Dad came to me with an old photo album he'd found tucked away in the attic. It was filled with pictures of Grandpa, young, strong, smiling with a pride that seemed to fill every frame. He handed it to me without a word, but I knew what it meant. It was a bridge, an unspoken truce, a way of saying, maybe we can find our way back. We spent hours going through those photos, sharing memories I hadn't heard before, stories of Grandpa's stubbornness, his kindness, the way he loved his family even when it wasn't easy. Those stories became the foundation of our rebuilding, reminders that beneath the hurt, the blood that connected us was stronger than the wounds. I also threw myself into the work of managing Grandpa's trust and the community projects we'd started. It wasn't just about honoring him. It was about creating something lasting, something that could bring people together instead of tearing them apart. Scholarships, in Grandpa's name, helped kids in our town pursue their dreams. Community gardens blossomed where the ranch once stood, and slowly, the pain began to transform into purpose. But it wasn't always smooth. There were days when the past crept back in, when old wounds flared, and the ghosts of that stormy night threatened to pull us under. I had to remind myself and Dad that healing isn't a straight path. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes feels impossible. But every time we chose to face it, to talk instead of turning away, we grew a little stronger. One of the hardest moments came when I realized that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant holding the pain and the love in the same hand, learning to live with both. Grandpa's legacy wasn't just about what he left behind, but what we chose to do with it. And for me, that meant standing up for him, for my family, and for the kind of man I wanted to be. Looking back now, I see that stormy night as the turning point, the moment everything was broken, but also the moment the real story began. It's a story of loss and love, of betrayal and hope, and most of all, of the ties that bind us even when they're stretched to the breaking point. Because family isn't perfect, it's messy, it's painful, but it's also the strongest force I know. And no matter what comes next, I'm ready to face it with Grandpa's spirit guiding me, and the promise to never let that legacy fade away. There were nights when I'd lie awake, the weight of everything pressing down on me, and wonder if I was really strong enough to carry Grandpa's legacy. It felt like the kind of burden that could crush a man carrying the hopes of someone who had given his life to a dream, a family, a promise. But then I'd remember his steady hands, the way he faced every hardship without complaint, the quiet strength that had built that ranch from the ground up. If he could do that, then I could find the strength to face this storm, no matter how fierce. I began to see our family in a new light, not just as a fractured group caught in pain and anger, but as people who were hurting just like me. Dad's pride had been bruised deeply, and that night when he turned Grandpa away was more than a moment of cruelty. It was the breaking point of years of frustration and fear he never knew how to express. It didn't excuse what he did, but it helped me understand, and understanding is the first step toward forgiveness. So I reached out again and again, trying to bridge the gap with Dad. Sometimes he shut me out, other times he let me in a little, but each conversation chipped away at the walls we'd built. We started sharing memories, not just the good, but the messy, complicated ones too. The arguments Grandpa had with Dad, the sacrifices no one knew about, the silent ways they had loved each other despite it all. Slowly, the story we'd told ourselves began to change. It wasn't just a story of betrayal or loss anymore. It was a story of resilience, of a family fighting to find their way back from the edge. I saw Dad soften, little by little, as he stepped into his own pain and regret. And in those moments, I found the courage to be vulnerable too, to admit that I was hurt, scared, and unsure of the future. But amidst the healing, I never forgot Grandpa's final wish. The trust he placed in me wasn't just about money. It was about honor, about protecting the values he held dear. So I poured myself into that responsibility, building scholarships, supporting local families, and keeping Grandpa's memory alive in the community that had raised us both. One afternoon, as I stood at the edge of the town's new community garden planted where Grandpa's ranch house once stood, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The garden was growing, the community was coming together, and for the first time since that stormy night, I believed we could heal. This journey hasn't been easy, and I know the road ahead will have its challenges. But I also know that family, with all its flaws and struggles, is worth fighting for. Grandpa's legacy isn't just the land he sold or the money he left behind. It's the lessons he taught us about love, loyalty, and the strength to stand tall even when everything falls apart. And as I face the future, I carry those lessons with me, ready to write the next chapter of our family's story. One built not on betrayal, but on hope, forgiveness, and the promise that no matter what, we will endure. The mornings grew colder as the seasons turned, but inside me, something was warming, a slow, steady fire, fueled by purpose and the memory of Grandpa's strength. I found myself waking earlier, determined to honor his legacy in every way I could. The trust money was more than a gift. It was a responsibility, a beacon to guide me through the storm that had shattered my family. I spent hours meeting with the community leaders, setting up foundations, and planning scholarships in Grandpa's name. These weren't just programs to hand out money, they were lifelines for kids who reminded me of the small town dreams Grandpa had always believed in. Each scholarship was a promise that his hard work, his sacrifices, would ripple forward, touching lives far beyond our family. Dad's involvement was still hesitant, but it was there, a quiet presence at events, a hand offering help when no one was looking. It wasn't perfect. There were still days filled with tension, the ghosts of past mistakes lurking in the corners. But the cracks in our relationship were slowly filling with something new: understanding, respect, and maybe even forgiveness. One evening, after a long day at a community fundraiser, Dad and I sat on the porch, the same one Grandpa had loved. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and fresh earth. We didn't say much at first, just sat side by side, sharing the silence that had once felt impossible. Then he spoke, not as the stern father I'd known, but as a man who had carried his own pain and regrets for too long. "I never wanted it to end like this," he said quietly. "I was scared. I thought if I let him in, I'd lose control, lose myself. But I see now, I lost more than I ever imagined." His words cracked something open in me. I reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "We're both here now. That's what matters." It wasn't a fairy tale ending, it never would be. But it was real, and it was ours. As the months passed, I began to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but learning to live with it, to carry the pain and the love together. Grandpa's legacy was not just a story of betrayal or money. It was a testament to resilience, to the power of standing up for what's right, and to the enduring strength of family. I realized that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought within ourselves, and that the greatest victories come from choosing hope over bitterness. Now, as I look back on that stormy night, the night everything changed, I don't see just pain or betrayal. I see the beginning of a journey to rebuild, to forgive, and to carry forward the legacy of a man who taught me that family isn't just about blood or money, but about love, honor, and the courage to keep fighting, no matter what. And I'm ready to keep fighting. I realize that sometimes the hardest battles we face aren't the ones with others, but the ones we fight inside ourselves. Wrestling with anger, disappointment, and the aching need for justice can tear us apart if we let it. But Grandpa's story taught me something powerful, that true strength comes not from holding on to bitterness, but from choosing hope and forgiveness even when it feels impossible. It was a lesson written in every wrinkle on his weathered face, in the steady hands that had built a life from the ground up, and in the quiet dignity with which he faced the end. He showed me that the greatest victories aren't measured by money or power, but by the courage to face pain, to heal wounds, and to rebuild what's broken. In that realization, I found a kind of freedom. I stopped trying to carry the weight of the past alone and started embracing the possibility of a better future, one where the scars of betrayal didn't define us, but strengthened us. It meant letting go of the anger I'd held for so long, forgiving Dad for his mistakes, and forgiving myself for the times I felt powerless. It wasn't easy. Forgiveness rarely is. but every time I chose it, I felt a little lighter, a little stronger. And in those moments, I knew Grandpa's legacy was alive, not in the ranch that was gone, or the money that changed hands, but in the love and resilience that held us together, even when everything seemed to fall apart. This journey has taught me that family isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, even when it's hard, and choosing love again and again. And that's the kind of legacy I want to carry forward, one built on hope, courage, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us through every storm. This journey has taught me that family isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, even when it's hard, and choosing love again and again. It means forgiving not just others, but ourselves, accepting our flaws and mistakes as part of the messy, beautiful story that makes us who we are. I've learned that family isn't just about the moments of joy and laughter, but also the times when we stumble, hurt, and have to find the strength to keep going. I've come to understand that love isn't always easy or convenient. Sometimes it demands patience when we're exhausted, grace when we feel wronged, and courage when everything inside us wants to give up. But it's those very challenges that give love its power, the power to heal, to rebuild, and to transform even the deepest wounds. Looking back on everything, the stormy night, the betrayal, the pain, and the slow, difficult path toward healing, I realize it was all part of a greater story. A story about resilience, redemption, and the unbreakable ties that bind us no matter what. Grandpa's legacy wasn't just about the ranch or the money. It was about teaching us how to be better, how to hold on to hope when it feels like everything is falling apart. Now, as I stand here carrying his memory forward, I know that the true inheritance isn't something you can put a dollar value on. It's the lessons we pass down, the love we share, and the strength we find in each other. That's the legacy I want to leave behind, one that honors Grandpa's life and reminds us all that no matter how dark the storm, family is worth fighting for. Because in the end, family is everything, and that's a promise I intend to keep every day for the rest of my life. Thank you for listening to my story. It's not just mine. It's a reminder that every family has its battles, its secrets, and its moments of heartbreak. But it's also proof that no matter how deep the wounds, there is always hope for healing and a chance to rebuild what was lost. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: don't wait for perfect circumstances or perfect people to find peace. Choose love, choose forgiveness, choose to stand strong, even when it feels impossible. Because that's how we honor those who came before us, by becoming better, by carrying their legacy with courage, and by never giving up on family. This is James, signing off with hope in my heart and a promise to keep fighting for what truly matters.